The sterile gleam of the Ethelred Medical Center's diagnostics wing seemed to magnify Clara Thorne's simple, faded uniform. Amidst the whispered consultations and the hum of cutting-edge machines, she was an almost invisible presence, often mistaken for cleaning staff, her sensible shoes making barely a sound on the polished floors. Today, the hushed urgency around Patient Zero's baffling case had drawn the top minds, including the celebrated Dr. Alistair Vance, whose tailored suit radiated authority, and Dr. Serena Reed, her young, brilliant eyes fixed on shimmering genetic readouts. Utterly anomalous, Vance declared, gesturing at a projected blood panel. No known markers for anything common. Clara, her gaze lingering on a faint, almost imperceptible anomaly within the data, cleared her throat softly. Doctor, might I suggest checking for a specific protein cluster? It's extraordinarily rare, seen only in. Dr. Reed cut her off with a polite but dismissive wave. Nurse Thorne, we're dealing with groundbreaking pathology here, not old wives' tales. Your decades of general observation are appreciated, but hardly relevant. Vance offered a patronizing smile. Clara's shoulders sagged imperceptibly, the familiar weight of being ignored settling on her. They saw only an aged, unassuming woman. They did not see the vast, forgotten library of ailments etched into her mind, a memory holding the key to this very anomaly. The patient's life hung by a thread, and only Clara recognized the pattern, a pattern they were actively refusing to see. Soon, they would have no choice. Vance's patronizing smile lingered, a silent dismissal that echoed through the sterile silence of the diagnostics wing's observation room. Dr. Serena Reed, a vision of sharp intellect and tailored elegance, turned from the shimmering holographic display of the patient's latest neurological scan. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled back in a severe, perfect bun, framing eyes that, even behind designer glasses, held a cool, assessing glint. She spared Clara a fleeting glance, then addressed Vance. Alistair, are we certain the latest genomic sequencing didn't miss anything? The cytokine storm is escalating, and the current therapy is having precisely zero effect. Her voice, crisp and modulated, implied that only her concerns, her advanced data, truly mattered. Clara, her hands clasped loosely in front of her faded blue uniform, cleared her throat softly. Dr. Reed, I've seen a pattern of rapid cytokine elevation combined with this specific neurological presentation in a very rare case. The blood markers. Reed cut her off, not even turning fully. Nurse Thorne, with all due respect, we're dealing with cutting-edge diagnostics here. Genomic sequencing, advanced immunological profiling. We require data-driven insights, not anecdotal observations from a general ward. Her tone was not unkind, but utterly dismissive, as if shooing away a bothersome insect. Vance nodded in agreement, his gaze returning to a bank of glowing monitors that pulsed with complex algorithms and genomic readouts. Precisely, Vance added, without looking at Clara. While your years on the floor are no doubt valuable for patient comfort, medical science has advanced beyond patterns and rare cases gleaned from memory. Our algorithms sift through terabytes of data. Your input, while quaint, simply lacks the empirical basis required for a condition of this complexity. He adjusted the cuffs of his impeccably tailored suit, the movement a silent statement of his unwavering superiority and the impeccable standard of his department. The familiar sting, sharp and hot, pricked at Clara's eyes. She pressed her lips together, fighting the urge to speak again, to argue. How could she explain that her memory was more precise than their algorithms for this specific anomaly? That her anecdotes were etched case studies, not vague recollections? The patient, a young woman named Anya, lay in a critical state just beyond the glass walls of their pristine lab. Anya's life was fading, and Clara alone held the forgotten key. Dr. Kian Patel, a bright young resident with earnest eyes and a slightly rumpled lab coat, paused hesitantly near Clara, sensing the tension. He'd seen Clara's quiet competence on the ward, had even heard whispers of her uncanny diagnostic hunches. Excuse me, Dr. Vance, Dr. Reed, he began tentatively, Nurse Thorne does have an extraordinary recall for obscure conditions. Perhaps. Vance finally turned, a chillingly polite smile on his face. Dr. Patel, an appreciation for history is commendable, but we are making history, not reliving it. Our patient requires solutions derived from contemporary science, not folklore. I suggest you focus on mastering the intricacies of the quantum resonance imager, rather than entertaining nostalgic diversions. His gaze swept over Clara, then back to Patel, a clear warning. Patel flushed, murmuring an apology, and quickly retreated to the far end of the room, avoiding Clara's eyes. The message was unmistakable. To align with Clara was to risk one's own professional standing in this rarefied atmosphere. The glass walls of the diagnostics wing offered panoramic views of the city's skyline, but also of the lab itself. Other specialists, observing their own screens or conversing in hushed, intelligent tones, couldn't help but notice the exchange. A few junior nurses, carefully setting up automated drips, darted furtive glances. The message was clear. Clara Thorne, the seasoned general ward nurse, was out of her depth, an anachronism in this temple of modern medicine. Her presence, her very uniform, seemed to clash with the gleaming chrome, the hushed beeps of advanced machinery, and the hushed, educated voices that filled the space. Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but her shoulders remained straight. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her shrink. The years had taught her that outward displays of emotion only fueled their dismissiveness. Instead, she focused on Anya's data flickering across the main screen, the rapidly deteriorating liver function, the unprecedented spikes in specific enzyme markers, the unusual cellular morphology in the latest biopsy. Each data point, to them, was a puzzle. To Clara, it was a confirmation, a piece of a story she knew by heart, a story of forgotten ailments and the subtle clues they left behind. Reed, having reviewed another complex diagnostic report on her tablet, sighed dramatically, tapping her pen impatiently against the pristine glass. The genomic analysis shows absolutely no known genetic predispositions for this array of symptoms. And the immunological markers are just off the charts in a way that defies all current models. It's almost as if we're dealing with an entirely new pathology. She looked directly at Clara, her expression shifting from irritation to thinly veiled sarcasm. "Nurse Thorne, did you have another of your observations?" Her tone was a challenge rather than an invitation, designed to publicly discredit any further interjections. Clara took a slow breath. "It's not new, Dr. Reed. It's just exceedingly rare. I remember a similar presentation, the specific combination of elevated factor X, the unusual vacuolation in the hepatocytes, and the very particular pattern of cortical microinfarcts, from a collection of case studies published in the Journal of Obscure Tropical Medicine from 1978. There was an addendum in '83. It pointed to a variant of hemosporidian encephalopathy, often misdiagnosed as autoimmune, but only if a specific, tiny lipid marker is present in the plasma. It's almost always overlooked because it degrades quickly in standard samples, requiring immediate cold chain analysis." She spoke quietly, clearly, the words precise and measured, each term a piece of a forgotten puzzle, articulated with the quiet authority of profound knowledge. Vance scoffed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief that cut through the sterile air. "Hemosporidian encephalopathy? Nurse Thorne, are you suggesting we're dealing with a forgotten jungle fever in the heart of London's most advanced hospital? Based on a journal from the last century? That's, frankly, preposterous." He laughed, a dry, humorless sound, and Reed joined him, a soft, polite titter that was far more cutting than any outright insult. "With all due respect, Nurse Thorne," Reed said, her voice now edged with a condescending sweetness that felt like a slap, "your historical knowledge is admirable, but we must operate in the present. This patient is critical. We need viable, evidence-based hypotheses, not academic curiosities. Perhaps you could focus on ensuring patient comfort, as is your primary role. Leave the advanced diagnostics to those of us trained for it." Her words were a definitive wall, built of polite disdain and institutional authority, slamming shut any further possibility of Clara being heard. Clara felt the full weight of it then, the public humiliation, the utter dismissal of her lifelong dedication, the casual erasure of her wisdom. She stood there, an old rock against a relentless tide, her heart aching for Anya. They were so confident in their gleaming machines, their cutting-edge degrees, their sophisticated ignorance. They would not see. Not yet. But Anya's condition was worsening rapidly, a silent, internal scream against the backdrop of their gleaming indifference. Soon, the data, even their own precious, empirical data, would speak for her. And then, they would have no choice but to listen. The immense satisfaction, when it came, would be worth the wait, but for now, there was only the cold, familiar bite of being profoundly, dangerously, underestimated. The sterile hum of the Ethelred's diagnostics wing usually soothed Clara, a familiar drone that underscored the serious work within. Today, it felt like a buzzing mockery, a high-pitched note of the institution's unwavering confidence in its own brilliance. Anya lay in room 3, her pale form a stark contrast to the vibrant, almost aggressive, displays of the monitors that surrounded her. Her breathing had grown shallower, punctuated by a troubling, almost imperceptible tremor that Clara alone seemed to notice. The intricate web of wires and tubes, each connected to a machine designed to distill the body's secrets into data points, seemed to offer little comfort. Dr. Alistair Vance, his silver hair impeccably styled, peered at a holographic projection of Anya's latest blood panel, his brow furrowed in concentration. Beside him, Dr. Serena Reed, her designer glasses perched on her nose, swiped through a genetic sequence on a transparent display, her lips pursed. They were brilliant, certainly, but their brilliance seemed to cast a shadow over anything that didn't conform to their meticulously structured world of algorithms and peer-reviewed journals. Remarkable, Vance murmured, tracing a finger across the shimmering data. Elevated serum ferritin, but within a range that contradicts a clear iron overload. And the erythrocyte sedimentation rate remains perplexing, not aligning with a conventional inflammatory response. Reed nodded, her gaze fixed. The genomic mapping shows no known mutations correlating with her presenting symptoms. We've cross-referenced every rare disease database. It's a phantom, Alistair. Clara, standing a respectful distance away, her hands clasped, felt a familiar prickle of recognition. The constellation of symptoms, the discordant lab results, the subtle muscular fasciculations that Vance and Reed dismissed as stress-induced. It was all there, a ghost from an old, forgotten textbook. "Excuse me, doctors," Clara began, her voice soft but clear, cutting through the low murmur of their discussion. They paused, turning towards her with a slow, almost annoyed deliberation, as if interrupted by a misplaced service drone. "I've observed a slight increase in the patient's scleral icterus this morning, and the capillary refill time seems to be slowing. Perhaps." Vance arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, a gesture that conveyed a century of institutional disdain. "Nurse Thorne, I appreciate your attentiveness to the patient's comfort, but we are discussing highly complex diagnostic anomalies. Visual observation, while charmingly quaint, is hardly the bedrock of modern medicine. Perhaps you should focus on ensuring her fluids are regulated." He gestured vaguely at an 4-drip. Reed offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Indeed, Clara. We have multiple high-definition cameras monitoring her vitals, and optical sensors detecting the minutest color shifts. Your insights, while well-intentioned, are redundant. We're searching for genetic markers, not evaluating the quality of the latest hospital meal." A flush crept up Clara's neck, but she pressed on, driven by Anya's increasingly shallow breaths. "Yes, doctor. But I've also noticed a specific pattern in the microhematocrit results, a subtle, almost imperceptible, clustering of erythrocyte fragments that might be indicative of a very specific, inherited hemolytic anemia. It's a marker for—" Vance let out a soft, dismissive chuckle, turning back to his holographic display. "Erythrocyte fragments? Nurse Thorne, we have automated cell counters capable of distinguishing between 32 different cellular morphologies. If there were anything significant, it would have been flagged in triplicate. Are you suggesting our multi-million-dollar diagnostic suite is somehow missing what your eyes can discern?" His tone dripped with sarcasm. Reed, meanwhile, began typing furiously on her tablet, completely ignoring Clara. "We're resequencing the mitochondrial DNA, Alistair. There's a slim chance of a novel mutation in the OXPHOS genes, though the clinical picture isn't entirely congruent." Clara felt the familiar sting, the erasure of her experience. She wasn't just observing, she was connecting decades of fragments, symptoms, and obscure research. But if you look at the histogram for the red cell distribution width and cross-reference it with the haptoglobin levels over the last 48 hours, it forms a classic, if extremely rare, signature. It's similar to cases described by Professor Armitage in his 1957 treatise on atypical hemoglobinopathies, particularly involving a variant of. Vance finally turned, his face a mask of barely concealed irritation. He took a step closer, his voice dropping, but laced with a chilling condescension that made Clara feel like a naughty child. Nurse Thorne, with all due respect, are you suggesting that a textbook from star 1957 star holds more answers than our state-of-the-art genetic sequencers and AI-driven diagnostic algorithms? Professor Armitage? Is he still practicing, or perhaps conducting seances? He chuckled, and a few younger residents, who had gathered, offered nervous, sycophantic titters. Reed looked up, her expression a mix of pity and exasperation. Clara, perhaps you've been spending too much time in the archives. We're dealing with cutting-edge science here, not medical folklore. What you're describing sounds like a collection of old wives' tales masquerading as medical theory. We're looking for evidence, for empirical data, not anecdotes. She paused, then added, with an overly sweet smile, your dedication to patient history is admirable, but this isn't a historical reenactment. Clara felt her cheeks burn. The weight of their combined dismissiveness pressed down on her, shrinking her, making her feel small and insignificant. Anya's life, she knew, hinged on this precise, forgotten detail, yet she was being treated as if she were spouting nonsense, an embarrassing anachronism. She had seen this specific combination twice before in her career, once in a patient who eventually succumbed after misdiagnosis, and once in a close family member for whom diagnosis had come tragically late. The memory of that personal loss fueled her, even as their words chipped away at her professional dignity. The specific marker, Clara insisted, her voice trembling slightly but retaining its quiet resolve, is often overlooked because it manifests as a double anomaly in both the MCV and MCH, pushing them just outside the typical high and low thresholds, making them appear normal to standard algorithms. It's a genetic mutation that impacts globin chain synthesis, but not in the way current databases categorize it. It's a trans-splicing defect. Vance threw his hands up in theatrical exasperation. A trans-splicing defect? In an obscure hemoglobinopathy from the mid-20th century? Nurse Thorne, you are quite clearly overreaching. Your imagination is getting the better of you. Perhaps the night shifts are finally taking their toll. Or maybe you need a refresher on basic hematology. We have excellent online courses. His voice grew sharper, drawing more attention. Let's be clear, Clara. Your role is supportive. We appreciate your efforts, but you are not a diagnostician. You are not a pathologist. You are not a geneticist. You have no advanced degrees, no publications, no research grants. Your place is at the bedside, ensuring comfort, not attempting to rewrite medical textbooks with fanciful theories. Reed stepped forward, her gaze cool and critical. Honestly, Clara, this is becoming disruptive. You're confusing anecdotal observation with scientific rigor. We're dealing with a human life here, not an academic debate you're ill-equipped to join. Perhaps it's best if you step out and allow us to continue our work without distractions. Her tone implied Clara herself was the distraction, a fly buzzing in their pristine, intellectual space. Clara felt a profound ache, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Her decades of experience, her tireless self-education, her quiet dedication, all dismissed as a geriatric delusion. She was being told, unequivocally, that she was worthless in this sacred space of healing, her knowledge an affront to their superior intellect. The humiliation was a physical weight, pressing down, threatening to crack her carefully maintained composure. She was a ghost in her own profession, her voice unheard, her insight ridiculed. Anya's labored breathing felt like a silent accusation against her inability to break through their arrogance. Vance, perhaps sensing her quiet defeat, decided to deliver the final, crushing blow, or so he thought. He spun to face her fully, a glint of challenge in his eyes, tired of her persistence, eager to silence her for good. You claim to possess this unique insight, Nurse Thorne. This ability to spot unseen markers. Fine. Prove it. Our machines process millions of data points, cross-referencing against every known anomaly. If you are so confident in your ancient knowledge, if you truly believe you can pinpoint something we cannot, then do so. Tell us precisely what this specific, unheard-of disease is. Give us its exact genetic pathway, its precise pathological manifestation in the blood, and what, according to your intuition, will be its next, definitive clinical symptom within the next 24 hours. And do it without access to any of our current diagnostic equipment, without even touching a patient chart. Just your instinct and observation. Because frankly, Nurse Thorne, your continued interruptions are wasting precious time. Otherwise, I suggest you return to your actual duties, and leave the diagnosing to the qualified professionals. His voice was dismissive, his gaze challenging, utterly convinced she would fail spectacularly. The impossible gauntlet had been thrown. All right, you. We've explored depths, much like our story seeks true understanding. But there's so much more to uncover here. If you're enjoying this journey of discovery, hit that subscribe button. Don't miss the next vital insight. Join our quest. Clara accepted the impossible gauntlet without a word, her expression unreadable. Dr. Vance, a triumphant sneer still playing on his lips, gestured expansively towards the glass-walled corridors. Very well, Nurse Thorne. The wing is yours. Do try not to contaminate any of our pristine surfaces with your intuition. Dr. Reed merely offered a patronizing chuckle, turning back to a glowing holographic display as if Clara had already faded into irrelevance. Clara simply nodded, her sensible shoes making no sound on the polished floors. She didn't hurry, didn't falter. With the quiet determination that had defined her career, she began her rounds. She walked past patient rooms, her gaze lingering, not on the complex readouts flickering above beds, but on the individuals within. Her attention was drawn to the subtle, the almost imperceptible tremor in a patient's left hand, the faint, unusual bruising hidden beneath a sleeve, the barely there yellowish tinge to the whites of an eye that even the most meticulous intern might dismiss as inadequate sleep. Her first stop was room 312. A young man, early 20s, presented with persistent fatigue and unexplained muscle weakness. Vance and Reed had already dismissed him as a case of chronic fatigue syndrome, perhaps exacerbated by mild depression, a common, if frustrating, diagnosis. Clara paused at his doorway. She noted the subtle, almost metallic scent in the air, the way his fingers curled just so, a slight asymmetry in his facial musculature when he attempted a weak smile. Her mind, a vast, silent library of obscure pathology, whirred to life. She didn't need a chart to know his blood work, unseen by her, would likely show unusually high creatinine kinase levels, coupled with specific amino acid markers that pointed away from mere fatigue. She leaned in, her voice a soft murmur. Has anyone checked for signs of a possible mitochondrial myopathy, perhaps a variant of Kearns-Sayre syndrome? Pay particular attention to the ocular muscles, and if possible, a muscle biopsy for ragged red fibers. I suspect you'll also find specific lactate and pyruvate elevations. Her words, precise and unhurried, hung in the air. Vance, who had followed her with amused condescension, scoffed. Kearns-Sayre? Nurse Thorne, that's an extremely rare, progressive disorder. His symptoms are far too mild for that. Reed, catching up, rolled her eyes. Are we back to textbooks from the 1950s? Our genetic sequencing would have flagged anything like that. Clara didn't argue. She simply gave a faint, knowing nod, and moved on. Her next observation was a middle-aged woman in room 318, admitted for intractable skin lesions and intermittent fever. The dermatologists had been stumped, ruling out all common autoimmune conditions. Clara observed the unique pattern of the lesions, a faint, net-like discoloration beneath the superficial rash, almost like a ghost of a livedo reticularis, but with a peculiar, purplish hue. She noticed the slight puffiness around the woman's eyes, the way she kept unconsciously rubbing her temples. Have you considered a very rare presentation of Sneddon syndrome? Clara asked quietly, directing her words to an unseen medical resident nearby, knowing Vance and Reed would overhear. It's often misdiagnosed as lupus or other vasculitides. Look for cerebral involvement, possibly small, silent strokes on an MRI. And pay close attention to her platelet count and inflammatory markers. They might be subtly elevated, but not in a typical pattern. Vance actually stopped walking. Sneddon syndrome was obscure, even for him. He shot a glance at Reed, who, for the first time, looked less amused and more perplexed. She's just throwing out medical trivia, Reed muttered, trying to regain her composure. Broken clock, twice a day. But Clara was already moving. Room after room, she walked, her observations becoming increasingly sharp, increasingly precise. She pointed out a barely noticeable yellowish-green tint on the sclera of a patient diagnosed with simple dyspepsia, suggesting a deep-seated, extremely rare bile duct anomaly that would manifest with specific, almost undetectable, bilirubin fractions. For another, a patient with unexplained neurological symptoms, she noted a particular tremor in the jaw and a subtly altered gait, recalling an equally rare inherited metabolic disorder, predicting the exact, elevated levels of an enzyme Vance had only read about in a historical medical text. The snickers from Vance and Reed slowly died. Their confident strides faltered. As Clara moved through the pristine wing, their expressions morphed from disdain to unease, then to a dawning, terrifying doubt. They started to make hushed calls, checking Clara's pronouncements against actual charts, against preliminary lab results that had baffled them. A young resident, privy to their whispered conversations, hesitantly approached Vance. "Dr. Vance, the current Sayer patient, we ran a targeted screen based on Nurse Thorne's initial comment. His lactate and pyruvate are significantly elevated, and an ophthalmology consult confirmed early ocular muscle weakness that had been missed." Vance's face hardened, but a flicker of genuine shock crossed his eyes. He dismissed the resident curtly, but his gaze kept returning to Clara, now a quiet whirlwind of diagnostic precision. The climax arrived in room 325. This was the wing's greatest challenge, a patient whose constellation of symptoms had confounded the Ethelred's entire team of specialists for weeks. Profound anemia, inexplicable bruising, rapidly deteriorating neurological function, and an intermittent, bizarre skin mottling that defied categorization. Every advanced test had been run, every cutting-edge genetic sequence performed, yielding nothing but dead ends. Dr. Reed herself had spent countless hours on this case, convinced it was a novel genetic mutation. Clara entered the room. She stood for a long moment beside the bed, her gaze sweeping over the patient's frail form. Her eyes meticulously tracked the subtle, almost unnoticeable changes in skin texture, the specific paleness of the nail beds, the faint tremor that seemed to originate deep within the bones. Her hidden talent wasn't just memory, it was the ability to synthesize disparate, barely visible clues into a coherent, often unprecedented, diagnostic picture. Her mind sifted through decades of obscure journals, forgotten case studies, and the haunting echo of a deeply personal memory linked to an almost mythical disease. Then, she spoke, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the sterile silence of the elite wing. "This is a manifestation of familial dysautonomia, type 2, often linked to the Riley-Day syndrome, but with a unique presentation that points to a specific genetic variant affecting iron metabolism and vascular integrity. The anemia and bruising are red herrings. The core issue is a profoundly rare malfunction in the autonomic nervous system's regulation of cellular processes, impacting both neurological function and vascular stability." Vance and Reed stared at her, utterly dumbfounded. Familial dysautonomia was known, yes, but not in this presentation, and certainly not type 2, which was so rare it was often considered a theoretical construct. "The key," Clara continued, her eyes still on the patient, "is not in the obvious blood counts, but in specific, incredibly subtle markers. You need to look for a severely depressed serum norepinephrine level, combined with paradoxical hypertension and a remarkably low percentage of specific growth factors. And if you run a genetic panel specifically targeting the IGCAP gene, looking for very particular splice site mutations, you will find your answer." A profound silence descended upon the wing. Vance's jaw was slack. Reed's celebrated genetic expertise had just been utterly eclipsed by a general ward nurse who had never touched a chart. Her face, usually composed and confident, was now a mask of bewildered rage and humiliation. Vance, despite himself, felt a cold dread creep into his gut. The specificity, the audacity, the sheer improbability of her claim. He couldn't ignore it. He turned to a junior doctor, his voice strained. "Order it. All of it. Now. Target the ICCAP gene. And get those specific assays for norepinephrine and growth factors." The next few hours were agonizing. The cutting-edge machines of the Ethelred Medical Center, designed for speed and precision, word and processed. Vance and Reed stood by, their faces pale, their tailored suits suddenly feeling constrictive, their academic laurels crumbling around them. When the results finally flashed on the main diagnostic screen, a hush fell over the assembled staff. The ICCAP gene showed the exact, specific splice site mutations Clara had predicted. Serum norepinephrine was severely depressed. The growth factor percentages were precisely as she had described. The confirmation was absolute. Clara Thorne, the overlooked, unassuming general ward nurse, had diagnosed the wing's most baffling case, identifying a condition so rare and a genetic variant so specific that it had eluded their collective expertise and their multi-million-dollar technology. Vance stared at the screen, his brilliant mind struggling to reconcile the data with his deeply ingrained prejudice. His face was a canvas of disbelief, awe, and a crushing, professional humiliation. Reed looked as though she had been struck. Her gaze, when it finally met Clara's, was no longer condescending, but filled with a stunned, almost frightened, respect. Clara, however, didn't revel in their shock. Her eyes, filled with a quiet, profound empathy, were still on the patient, now finally understood. A faint, almost imperceptible sigh escaped her lips, not of triumph, but of relief. The immense satisfaction was hers alone, a silent, internal vindication that resonated deeper than any shouted accolade. She had done what no one else could, not for glory, but for the patient. The faint hum of the advanced life support machinery, a constant companion in the diagnostics wing, seemed to sharpen in the sudden, profound silence that followed Clara's diagnosis. Dr. Vance, his face a mask of disbelief, stared at the diagnostic screen, then back at Clara, as if trying to reconcile the data with the unassuming woman before him. Dr. Reed, usually so composed, had unconsciously clutched her tablet, her knuckles white. Their earlier condescension had not merely evaporated, it had been incinerated, replaced by a dawning comprehension of their own intellectual limitations in the face of Clara's quiet brilliance. Clara, oblivious to their internal turmoil, moved with a seasoned nurse's efficiency. Her gaze, still fixed on the patient's pale face, registered the subtle improvements that had already begun even as the first specific treatment protocols were being initiated. She reached out, not to the monitors, but to the patient's hand, a gentle, reassuring touch. It was a gesture deeply rooted in human connection, a stark contrast to the sterile, high-tech environment, yet infinitely more powerful. Her voice, soft but clear, reached the newly assigned critical care nurse, ensure the electrolyte balance is monitored hourly for the first 12. The renal markers will be slow to respond, but watch for any acute fluctuations. Her words were not a suggestion but an instruction, delivered with an unshakable confidence that cut through the lingering disbelief in the room. The critical care nurse, a young woman fresh out of an elite program, met Clara's eyes, then nodded, jotting down the directive with an uncharacteristic urgency. It was a silent acknowledgement of authority, earned not by title or degree, but by undeniable competence. A small crowd had begun to gather at the periphery of the room, drawn by the unusual hush and the sudden shift in the specialist's demeanor. Junior residents, lab technicians, even a few other general ward nurses who knew Clara from her quiet rounds, paused in their duties. They had initially seen Dr. Vance and Dr. Reed's focused intensity, a common sight when a rare case stumped them. But now, their faces were a canvas of bewilderment. They watched as Dr. Vance, usually a paragon of controlled arrogance, fumbled with a stylus, his polished veneer cracking. He was frantically cross-referencing Clara's stated symptoms and diagnostic markers against a global medical database, his movements agitated, almost desperate. Dr. Reed, meanwhile, had recovered enough to approach the bedside, her initial shock giving way to a more scientific curiosity. "But, the specific genetic markers we tested for, they were negative," she murmured, her voice stripped of its usual dismissiveness, almost sounding like a question seeking an answer, rather than an assertion. Clara turned to her, a patient, knowing look in her eyes. Because the expression of the gene, while present, is often latent, or manifests in such a subtle way it's easily dismissed as a secondary symptom. The disease, as I recall from a paper published in the Journal of Obscure Pathologies in '78, Dr. Anya Sharma's seminal work, hinges on a specific enzymatic pathway, not a direct genetic mutation as is commonly assumed for most hereditary conditions. The full genetic panel wouldn't flag it unless you specifically knew what you were looking for, or rather, what else to look for. The room seemed to shrink, the silence deepening further. The Journal of Obscure Pathologies in '78. Vance echoed, his voice barely a whisper, a strange mix of awe and intellectual humiliation. This wasn't something taught in their high-tech, cutting-edge world. It was history, forgotten arcana, resurrected by a woman they had deemed irrelevant. He pulled up the journal, his fingers flying across the holographic interface, and there it was, Sharma, A. 1978. The peculiar manifestations of atrophiosclerosis mitis and its enzymatic basis. His jaw went slack. The symptoms, the diagnostic markers, the progression, it was all there, described with an almost poetic precision that mirrored Clara's own explanation. The crowd outside the room now pressed closer, a ripple of whispers starting to spread. They watched Dr. Vance, the untouchable genius, looking utterly floored. They watched Dr. Reed, the celebrated young star, staring at Clara with an expression akin to a student facing an unanswerable exam question, yet knowing the answer stood right before her. The senior attending physicians, known for their quick, sharp intellects, were exchanging incredulous glances. It was not just that Clara had been right, it was how she was right, citing forgotten research, drawing on a knowledge base so vast and unconventional it defied the very principles of their modern, streamlined medical education. Clara, however, wasn't basking in the unfolding drama. Her focus remained steadfastly on the patient, on the subtle flush returning to their cheeks, the steadying rhythm on the monitors. The initial low-dose steroid therapy should begin to stabilize the vascular fragility within the hour, she advised the critical care nurse, her voice calm and measured. Continue the supportive measures for the systemic inflammation. The patient will need careful monitoring for secondary infections given the prolonged immune suppression from the undiagnosed condition. Her instructions were so practical, so grounded in real patient care, that they served as an anchor in the whirlwind of intellectual revelation. She wasn't just a diagnostician, she was a nurse, attuned to every nuanced need of the human body. Dr. Vance, having verified the source and the profound accuracy of Clara's statement, slowly lifted his head, his eyes meeting hers. There was no arrogance left, only a profound, almost painful, respect. "Nurse Thorne," he began, his voice hoarse, I don't know what to say." He seemed to struggle for words, a rare sight for the eloquent pathologist. Your insight. It's extraordinary." Dr. Reed, equally humbled, stepped forward. "We, Dr. Vance and we were completely off track. We dismissed your initial observations. I apologize, Nurse Thorne." Profoundly. Her gaze was sincere, her earlier dismissiveness replaced by an earnest desire to learn. The young geneticist, usually fiercely proud, had finally recognized the true value of experience. Clara merely offered a small, gentle smile. "The patient is what matters, Dr. Reed," she replied, her voice still quiet, but now resonating with an undeniable authority that filled the elite space. "And sometimes," she added, her eyes sweeping across the glass walls, the gleaming equipment, and finally landing on the faces of the amazed junior staff, "the answers aren't always in the newest journals or the most advanced technology. Sometimes, they're in the quiet corners, in the forgotten histories, or simply in looking at things a little differently." Her words hung in the air, a profound indictment of the very culture of the Ethelred Medical Center, yet delivered with such grace and lack of malice that it felt like a lesson rather than a reprimand. The junior doctors and nurses in the doorway exchanged wide-eyed looks. They had just witnessed a quiet revolution. The hierarchies had been dismantled, not by force or confrontation, but by undeniable truth and humble wisdom. The immense satisfaction Clara felt was still internal, a deep well of quiet triumph. She had seen the patient, truly seen them, when others had been blinded by their own brilliance. She had given a voice to a forgotten disease, and in doing so, had offered a chance at life. The weight of being ignored, of having her wisdom dismissed, had lifted. In its place, a quiet dignity settled, firmer and more profound than any public acclaim could ever provide. Her simple, slightly faded uniform, her sensible shoes, and her neatly tied-back hair no longer made her an anachronism. They made her a beacon of genuine care and unparalleled insight in a world that had almost forgotten its value. Clara stood before the illuminated diagnostic screen, its complex data stream shimmering like an abstract painting. She didn't touch the controls, didn't need to. Her gaze, however, swept over the intricate graphs and parameters with an intensity that belied her unassuming posture. The patient's preliminary blood work, a jumble of numbers that had baffled the department's most advanced AI, seemed to coalesce into a coherent narrative under her quiet scrutiny. The eosinophil count, she began, her voice soft but steady, cutting through the hushed tension of the diagnostics wing. Dr. Vance, leaning back with an air of patronizing patience, barely twitched a muscle. Dr. Reed, tapping a pen against her chin, offered a faint, skeptical smile. They, and the 24 other medical professionals gathered, expected a misstep, a fumbled hypothesis. It's elevated, yes, but not dramatically so, Clara continued, pointing not with her finger, but with her unwavering gaze to a specific, almost negligible spike on the blood cell differential. But look closer at the morphology. The nuclei, they're hypersegmented, irregular. A subtle anomaly, easily dismissed as artifact or minor allergic reaction. But combined with the persistent, low-grade proteinuria, the intermittent paresthesia in the patient's extremities, and the unusual patchy pattern of demyelination on the earlier MRI, it paints a different picture. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The room remained silent, but a few heads, initially dismissive, began to tilt in curiosity. Vance shifted, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Reed stopped tapping her pen. These aren't typical symptoms of an autoimmune disorder, nor standard neurological degeneration, Clara explained, her voice gaining a quiet confidence. The pattern, the progression, it aligns with the early stages of a specific, exceedingly rare glycogen storage disease. Not the more common types, mind you, but a variant first documented in a single family in the Norwegian fjords in the late 19th century. Article by Dr. Gustav Sorensen, Journal of Obscure Pathologies, 1898, Volume 12, pages 241 to 255. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Vance's jaw tightened. Reed's eyes widened, her sophisticated genetic knowledge momentarily failing to conjure such an esoteric reference. A whisper rippled through the gathered experts, Sorensen. A 19th century journal, Clara, oblivious to the stir, continued her quiet exposition. The key, Dr. Vance, lies in the patient's initial presentation, the unexplained muscle weakness in childhood, the subtle cardiac irregularities that resolved spontaneously, and crucially, the very specific, almost imperceptible inclusions in the muscle biopsy samples taken years ago for a misdiagnosis of mitochondrial myopathy. Those inclusions, under electron microscopy, would show abnormal glycogen deposits, distinct from pampa or myocardial. She projected a complex, hand-drawn diagram onto a smaller screen, her own recreation from memory of a microscopic image from that ancient journal. It showed the very inclusions she described, juxtaposed with the patient's own past biopsy results, a connection no one had ever made. The gene responsible, though not widely screened for, is SLC2A2, typically associated with Fanconi-Bickel syndrome. However, in this ultra-rare variant, a specific missense mutation leads to a defective GLUT2 transporter not only in the liver and kidneys, but with a nuanced, less aggressive, systemic presentation affecting muscle and nerve tissue over decades. It mimics other conditions until it reaches a critical threshold, often triggered by a seemingly innocuous viral infection or metabolic stress, as in our patient's case. Her words, precise and authoritative, built an undeniable edifice of knowledge. Vance, who prided himself on his encyclopedic recall of modern pathology, found himself utterly outmatched. He searched his memory, rifled through mental databases, but found no trace of Sorensen, 1898. The sheer, audacious specificity of her claim was breathtaking. The resulting glycogen accumulation, Clara concluded, disrupts cellular function, particularly in high-energy demand tissues like the myocardium and certain neuronal pathways. This explains the patient's escalating neurological symptoms, the cardiac arrhythmias, and the profound, debilitating fatigue. The hypersegmented eosinophils, while not a primary marker, are a rare co-occurrence, a subtle inflammatory response to the cellular distress. She turned her gaze to the patient's recent genetic sequencing data on the main screen, a rainbow of base pairs. If you cross-reference the SLC2A2 locus, specifically exon 7, you will find a homozygous point mutation, G to A, at position 743. It's been flagged as a variant of unknown significance by your automated systems, Dr. Reed, because it's not in the common databases. But it aligns perfectly with the Sorensen variant. The silence in the room was absolute, punctuated only by the hum of the advanced machinery. Dr. Reed, her face pale, stared at the screen. She typed furiously, her fingers flying across the keyboard, cross-referencing, verifying. Her celebrated genetic expertise, her years of rigorous formal training, were being simultaneously challenged and expanded by a woman who learned from faded texts. After what felt like an eternity, but was perhaps only 30 seconds, Reed gasped. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and dawning respect. She's right, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The mutation, it's there. And the functional impact, though not formally recognized, matches the predicted protein alteration. Vance's face, usually a mask of detached intellect, was a study in professional humiliation. His reputation, his brilliance, had been built on his ability to see what others missed. Yet, Clara, the humble ward nurse, had seen through layers of cutting-edge diagnostics to a truth he hadn't even known existed. The treatment, Clara stated, her voice returning to its calm, practical tone, is not a simple pharmaceutical fix. It requires a highly specialized dietary regimen, precise glucose management, timed intake of uncooked cornstarch to provide a slow-release glucose source overnight, and specific amino acid supplementation. Additionally, targeted enzyme replacement therapy, though experimental for this variant, has shown promising results in animal models. The sooner it begins, the higher the chance of arresting the neurological decline and reversing some of the cardiac damage. She looked directly at Vance, then at Reed, then finally, with a gentle, hopeful gaze, at the patient's vitals on the screen. The maximum impact moment wasn't a shout or a triumphant gesture, but the quiet, undeniable power of her solution. It was the moment the room understood that she hadn't just identified a disease, she had offered a blueprint for life. Dr. Vance, for the first time in his professional life, found himself without a cutting remark, without a dismissive wave. He slowly, almost imperceptibly, nodded. It was a concession, a surrender, and a profound acknowledgement of error. Dr. Reed, meanwhile, had already begun drafting treatment protocols, her initial skepticism entirely replaced by an urgent, focused determination. One of the senior physicians from the neurology department, a man known for his rigorous academic standards, stepped forward. "Nurse Thorne," he said, his voice thick with a newfound deference, "that was extraordinary. A masterclass in clinical deduction and pathological recall. I've never witnessed anything quite like it." Others murmured their agreement, their faces reflecting awe and a deep sense of professional wonder. The snobbery, the institutional disdain, had vanished, replaced by a profound respect. Clara, her duty discharged, offered a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. Her gaze drifted back to the patient's data, her mind already shifting from diagnosis to care, from the abstract to the intensely personal. Her simple, slightly faded uniform, her sensible shoes, and her neatly tied-back hair no longer made her an anachronism. They made her a beacon of genuine care and unparalleled insight in a world that had almost forgotten its value. The immense satisfaction of her vindication was not in the public acclaim, but in the quiet, undeniable truth that she had, once again, given a voice to a forgotten disease, and in doing so, had offered a chance at life. The weight of being ignored had lifted. In its place, a quiet dignity settled, firmer and more profound than any recognition could ever provide. A hushed reverence settled over the diagnostics wing, a silence far more profound than the sterile calm that usually pervaded its gleaming corridors. The digital displays, moments ago a chaotic jumble of misread markers, now aligned with terrifying precision to Clara's pinpoint diagnosis. Dr. Eris Thorne, the head of internal medicine and a man renowned for his stoic composure, was the first to break it, his voice barely a whisper. "Nurse Thorne, you were right. Every single detail." The words hung in the air, a bell tolling the end of one era and the quiet beginning of another. Faces in the observation gallery, a mix of specialist doctors, junior residents, and concerned administrators, shifted from stunned disbelief to dawning comprehension. The casual dismissiveness that had often masked Clara's presence evaporated, replaced by expressions ranging from awe to a profound, unsettling shame. Senior consultants, who had merely tolerated her presence, now looked at her with a newfound, almost fearful respect. The younger staff, who had barely noticed her, stared as if witnessing a miracle, their own cutting-edge knowledge momentarily dwarfed by her quiet, unassuming brilliance. Clara, however, remained utterly unperturbed by the sudden shift in atmosphere. Her gaze, still fixed on the patient's rapidly stabilizing vitals, held no trace of triumph or superiority. Her victory was not a public spectacle, but a deeply personal, internal validation. The faint, almost imperceptible tremor that had accompanied her initial, ignored attempts to speak had vanished. In its place, her shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly, a quiet dignity settling over her like a comforting shawl. She had given a voice to a forgotten disease, and in doing so, had offered a chance at life. That was her reward, pure and unadulterated. A quiet, knowing calm bloomed within her chest, more satisfying than any applause. She offered a small, almost imperceptible nod to Dr. Thorne when he approached, his hand extended, not for a handshake of congratulation, but of profound apology. "Nurse Thorne," he began, his voice thick with unspoken meaning, "we owe you everything." Clara simply smiled, a gentle, genuine curve of her lips that reached her kind, tired eyes. "The patient is what matters, doctor." Her voice, always soft, now carried an undeniable authority, not of command, but of absolute truth. The immediate aftermath for Dr. Alistair Vance was a cascade of professional embarrassment that quickly snowballed into a serious review of his entire department. The brilliant but arrogant lead pathologist, who moments ago had radiated an aura of untouchable authority, now stood pale and visibly shaken. His tailored suit, once a symbol of his elite status, seemed to hang loosely, suddenly ill-fitting. The gleaming, state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment he so prided himself on, the very tools that had failed to yield the correct diagnosis, now seemed to mock him, shining reminders of his oversight. The immediate fallout was swift and brutal. Within hours, an emergency meeting of the medical board was convened, an unprecedented event for a diagnostics misfire. Dr. Vance, usually eloquent and self-assured, found himself stammering through explanations, his usual dismissive tone replaced by defensive bluster that rang hollow. The intricate PowerPoints he often presented with such flair were useless now. The stark reality was that a general ward nurse, armed with observation and forgotten knowledge, had achieved what his multi-million-dollar lab and highly trained team could not. His professional reputation, meticulously built over decades of groundbreaking and highly publicized work, began to fray at the edges. His name, once whispered with reverence in the halls of Ethelred, was now linked with a critical diagnostic failure that nearly cost a prominent patient their life. Rumors of his impending demotion from lead pathologist to a more administrative role, or even a forced sabbatical, began to circulate like wildfire through the hospital grapevine. Funding for his ambitious new research project, once a guaranteed certainty, was suddenly put on indefinite hold, pending an extensive review of current diagnostic protocols and leadership effectiveness within the pathology department. The icy politeness with which his superiors now addressed him was far more chilling than any outright anger. He found himself, for the first time in his career, an outsider looking in, his once secure world crumbling around him, exposed not by a rival, but by the quiet truth unveiled by a woman he had so effortlessly dismissed. The weight of his own arrogance, once his armor, now pressed down on him, suffocating him with its bitter irony. Dr. Serena Reed fared no better, though her dissent was arguably more focused on the academic and aspirational aspects of her career. The young, celebrated geneticist, whose rise had been meteoric, now faced a public and professional reevaluation. Her initial condescension towards Clara, punctuated by cutting remarks about old wives' tales and the irrelevance of intuition in an age of precision genomics, was now a matter of public record within the hospital's senior staff. The very attributes she had championed, cutting-edge technology and academic pedigree, had proven insufficient, even blind, to the truth. The immediate consequence was the postponement of her keynote address at the upcoming International Genomics Summit, an event where she was slated to present her latest groundbreaking research. The official reason cited was unforeseen scheduling conflicts, but the underlying message was clear: her credibility had taken a severe hit. Her grant applications, previously rubber-stamped, now faced unprecedented scrutiny. Review committees, once eager to fund her next big idea, began asking pointed questions about the practical application of theoretical genetics and the importance of a holistic diagnostic approach. Mentors who had championed her now offered lukewarm support, their encouragement laced with thinly veiled disappointment. Her carefully cultivated image as a brilliant prodigy, destined to revolutionize genetic medicine, began to crack. She found herself excluded from impromptu meetings where critical diagnostic decisions were being discussed, her once eager contributions now met with polite but firm redirection. The quiet murmurs of over-reliance on algorithms and lack of clinical intuition followed her, eroding her confidence. Dr. Reed, who had always believed that success was a matter of being the smartest and the most technologically advanced, was forced to confront the humbling reality that wisdom, observation, and plain old human experience still held an irreplaceable value, a value she had actively scorned. The Ethelred Medical Center, once her launchpad to unparalleled fame, now felt like a cage, its glass walls reflecting back not her triumphs, but her profound misjudgment. The aftermath at Ethelred Medical Center was swift and brutal for some. The patient's remarkable recovery, attributed solely to Clara's overlooked diagnosis, became an undeniable testament to her unique gift. An immediate, internal review, intensified by hushed whispers of an impending malpractice suit from the affluent patient's family, exposed the flagrant disregard for Clara's crucial insights. Dr. Alastair Vance, already reeling from the public humiliation of having his esteemed diagnosis overturned by a general ward nurse, found himself at the epicenter of the professional storm. The investigation meticulously detailed his dismissive conduct, his repeated interruptions, and his ultimate failure to consider alternative pathologies, even when presented with a compelling case. His grants, once sacrosanct, were frozen. His upcoming publication in a prestigious medical journal, previously assured, was indefinitely postponed. The cutting-edge diagnostic tools he so championed, once seen as extensions of his genius, now felt like silent accusers, having failed to detect what Clara's eyes and memory had effortlessly identified. He was suspended, his once brilliant career now tarnished by the indelible mark of professional negligence and arrogance. The gleaming, minimalist diagnostics wing, his personal empire, became the setting for his public demotion, its glass walls offering no refuge from the condemning gazes of his peers. Dr. Serena Reed, who had watched Vance's downfall with a chilling sense of dread, found her own trajectory plummeting. Her academic funding was immediately reviewed, her current research put under intense scrutiny. The cage she had felt building around her during the crisis now solidified into genuine professional confinement. Her celebrated paper on genetic markers for common conditions, awaiting peer review, was now scrutinized not just for its scientific merit, but for the methodology of its author, an author now known for her scornful dismissal of human observation. Her mentor, a revered figure in the genetics field, expressed a profound disappointment that was far more cutting than any reprimand. Reed found herself reassigned to a less glamorous, more administrative role, tasked with developing interdepartmental communication protocols, a thinly veiled attempt to force her to engage with the very people she had belittled. Her belief in technology as the sole arbiter of truth had not only been shattered but had left her career in splinters. The Ethelred Medical Center, in an urgent attempt at damage control and a genuine, if belated, reevaluation of its values, launched a comprehensive review of its entire operational culture. The incident became a catalyst for change, forcing the administration to confront the insidious elitism that had permeated its prestigious halls. New mandates were issued, emphasizing the critical importance of interdepartmental collaboration and, perhaps most significantly, establishing a formal system for all staff, regardless of rank or academic credentials, to have their clinical observations formally documented and reviewed by senior medical staff. Clara Thorne, the quiet nurse, became the reluctant face of this paradigm shift, her story a stark reminder that true wisdom often resided not in tailored suits or gleaming machinery, but in decades of patient-centered care. Yet, amidst the swirling chaos of institutional reform and the professional implosions of Vance and Reed, Clara Thorne remained Clara Thorne. The Ethelred Board, in a grand gesture of belated recognition, offered her an unprecedented position, senior clinical advisor for rare pathologies, a newly created role within the diagnostics wing, complete with a substantial salary increase, a private office overlooking the city, and an honorary professorship. It was everything the elite medical world valued and offered. Clara listened politely, her hands clasped, her gaze steady. Then, with a quiet grace that belied the monumental nature of her decision, she declined. "Thank you, truly," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's an immense honor. But my place is on Ward C. With my patients." She explained, simply and without embellishment, that her satisfaction came from the direct, tangible impact of her work, the comfort she could offer a frightened patient, the subtle shift in a vital sign she could catch, the familiar rhythm of the general ward. The glass walls and tailored suits of the diagnostics wing felt cold and impersonal. She missed the warm linoleum floors, the friendly banter with her fellow nurses, the small, intimate victories of everyday patient care. Her dedication to rare diseases wasn't for accolades or titles, but for the inherent, quiet challenge of understanding the human body in its most intricate, vulnerable forms, driven by a deep, personal connection to a disease that had once touched her life. And so, Clara Thorne returned to her authentic life. She resumed her shifts on Ward C, donning her simple, slightly faded uniform and her sensible shoes. She continued to tie her hair back neatly, her movements efficient and practiced. The hospital staff, from the newest intern to the most seasoned surgeon, no longer mistook her for cleaning staff. They greeted her with a new, profound respect, a quiet nod of acknowledgement for the woman who had reminded them all of the invaluable, often unseen, wisdom that walks among them. Clara, however, didn't dwell on the vindication or the newfound deference. Her worth, she knew, didn't depend on external approval or the validation of a prestigious institution. It resided in the quiet dignity of her purpose, in the meticulous care she offered each patient, and the deep well of knowledge she continued to cultivate purely for the sake of understanding and helping. She found immense satisfaction in the familiar routine, in the grateful eyes of a recovering patient, in the quiet hum of the ward at night. Her triumphs were no longer about proving herself, but about the profound, unshakable joy of being exactly who she was, a humble nurse, dedicated to healing, whose heart and mind were her most powerful diagnostic tools. The world had come to acknowledge her value, but Clara Thorne had known it all along. She simply smiled, a genuine, content smile, and went about her work. And that, my friends, is the heart of it all. As you just experienced, the greatest journeys often begin with a single step, fueled by the unwavering belief in your own unique power. Remember, every challenge is an opportunity to discover strength you never knew you possessed. Now, I want to hear from you. What part of this story resonated most deeply? Have you faced a moment of doubt only to find your own incredible resilience? Share your thoughts, your aha moments, and your own inspiring stories in the comments below. Let's build a community where we can uplift and empower each other.